So we began with the introduction by Daniel Pinchbeck, and then moved on to the general introduction, which we have yet to finish. So, a tribute to W.Y. Evans Wentz. Dr. Evans Wentz, who literally sat at the feet of a Tibetan Lama for years in order to acquire his wisdom, not only displays a deeply sympathetic interest in those esoteric doctrines so characteristic of the genius of the East, but likewise possesses the rare faculty of making them more or less intelligible to the layman. Quoted from a book review in Anthropology on the back of the Oxford University Press edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. W.Y. Evans Wentz is a great scholar who devoted his mature years to the role of a bridge and shuttle between Tibet and the West. Like an RNA molecule activating the latter with the coded message of the former, no greater tribute could be paid to the work of this academic liberator than to base our psychedelic manual upon his insights, and to quote directly his comments on the message of this book. The message is that the art of dying is quite as important as the art of living, or of coming into birth, of which it is the complement and summation, that the future of being is dependent, perhaps entirely, upon a rightly controlled death. As the second part of this volume, setting forth the art of reincarnating, emphasizes, the art of dying, as indicated by the death rite associated with initiation into the mysteries of antiquity, and referred to by Apuleius, the Platonic philosopher, himself an initiate, and by many other illustrious initiates, and as the Egyptian Book of the Dead suggests, appears to have been far better known to the ancient peoples inhabiting the Mediterranean countries than it is now by their descendants in Europe and the Americas. To those who had passed through the secret experiencing of the premortem death, right dying is initiation, conferring, as does the initiatory death rite, the power to control consciously the process of death and regeneration. Evans Wentz, page 13 through, page Roman numeral 13 through 14. The Oxford scholar, like his great predecessor of the 11th century, Marpa, the translator, who rendered Indian Buddhist texts into Tibetan, thereby preserving them from extinction, saw the vital importance of these doctrines and made them accessible to many. The secret is no longer hidden. The art of dying is quite as important as the art of living. Now for a tribute to Carl G. Jung. Psychology is the systematic attempt to describe and explain man's behavior, both conscious and non-conscious. The scope of study is broad, covering the infinite variety of human activity and experience. And it is long, tracing back through the history of the individual, through the history of his ancestors, back through the evolutionary vicissitudes and triumphs which have determined the current status of the species. Most difficult of all, the scope of psychology is complex, dealing as it does with processes which are ever-changing. Little wonder that Psychologists, in the face of such complexity, escape into specialization and parochial narrowness. Psychology is based on the available data and psychologists' ability and willingness to utilize them. The behaviorism and experimentalism of 20th century Western psychology is so narrow as to be mostly trivial. Consciousness is eliminated from the field of inquiry. Social application and social meaning are largely neglected. A curious ritualism is enacted by a priesthood rapidly growing in power and numbers. Eastern psychology, by contrast, offers us a long history of detailed observation and systematization of the range of human consciousness, along with an enormous literature of practical methods for controlling and changing consciousness. Western intellectuals tend to dismiss Oriental psychology. The theories of consciousness are seen as occult and mystical. The methods of investigating consciousness change, such as meditation, yoga, monastic retreat, and sensory deprivation, and are seen as alien to scientific investigation. And most damning of all in the eyes of the European scholar is the alleged disregard of Eastern psychologies for the practical, behavioral, and social aspects of life. Such criticism betrays limited concepts and the inability to deal with the available historical data on a meaningful level. I'm reading that sentence again. Such criticism betrays limited concepts and the inability to deal with the available historical data on a meaningful level. The psychologies of the East have always found practical application in the running of the state, in the running of family life and family, in the running of daily life and family. The psychologies of the East have always found practical application in the running of the state, in the running of daily life and family. A wealth of guides and handbooks exists. The Book of Tao, the Analects of Confucius, the Bhagavad Gita, the I Ching, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to mention only the best known. Eastern psychology can be judged in terms of the use of available evidence. The scholars and observers of China, Tibet, and India went as far as their data allowed them. They lacked the findings of modern science, and so their metaphors seem vague and poetic. Yet, this does not negate their value. Indeed, Eastern philosophic theories dating back 4,000 years adapt readily to the most recent discoveries of nuclear physics, biochemistry, genetics, and astronomy. A major task of any present-day psychology, Eastern or Western, is to construct a frame of reference large enough to incorporate the recent findings of the energy sciences into a revised picture of man, judged against the criterion of the use of available fact. The greatest psychologists of our century are William James and Carl Jung. To properly compare Jung with Sigmund Freud, we must look at the available data which each man appropriated for his explorations. For Freud, it was Darwin, classical thermodynamics, and the Old Testament, Renaissance, cultural history, and most important, the close overheated atmosphere of the Jewish family. The broader scope of Jung's reference materials assures that his theories will find a greater congeniality with recent developments in the energy sciences and the evolutionary sciences. A major task. Both of these men avoided the narrow paths of backtracking a little bit. A major task of any present-day psychology, Eastern or Western, is to construct a frame of reference large enough to incorporate the recent findings of the energy sciences into a revised picture of man, judged against the criterion of the use of available fact. The greatest psychologists of our century are William James and Carl Jung. Both of these men avoided the narrow paths of behaviorism and experimentalism. Both fought to preserve experience and consciousness as an area of scientific research. Both kept open to the advance of scientific theory, and both refused to shut off Eastern scholarship from consideration. Jung used for his source of data that most fertile source, the internal. He recognized the rich meaning of the Eastern message. He reacted to that great Rorschach inkblot, the Tao Te Ching. He wrote perceptive, brilliant forewords to the I Ching, to the secret of the golden flower, and struggled with the meaning of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. For years, ever since it was first published, the Bardo Todol has been my constant companion, and to it I owe not only many stimulating ideas and discoveries, but also many fundamental insights. Its philosophy contains the quintessence of Buddhist psychological criticism, and as such, one can truly say that it is of an unexampled superiority. The Bardo Todol is in the highest degree psychological in its outlook, but with us, philosophy and theology are still in the medieval. Pre-psychologicals. The Bardo Todol is the highest degree psychological in its outlook, but with us, philosophy and theology are still in the medieval pre-psychological stage, where only the assertions are listened to, explained, defended, criticized, and disputed, while the authority that makes them has, by general consent, been deposed as outside the scope of discussion. Metaphysical assertions, however, are statements of the psyche and are therefore psychological. To the Western mind, which compensates its well-known feelings of resentment by a slavish regard for rational explanations, this obvious truth seems all too obvious, or else it is seen as an inadmissible negation of metaphysical truth. Whenever the Westerner hears the word psychological, it always sounds to him like only psychological. Jung draws upon Oriental conceptions of consciousness to broaden the concept of projection. Not only the wrathful, but also the peaceful deities are conceived as samsaric projections of the human psyche, an idea that seems all too obvious to the enlightened European because it reminds them of their own banal simplifications. But though the European can easily explain away these deities as projections, they would be quite incapable of positing them at the same time as real. The Bardo Todo can do that, because in certain of its most essential metaphysical premises, it has the enlightened as well as the unenlightened European at a disadvantage. The ever-present, unspoken assumption of the Bardo Todol is the antinominal character of all metaphysical assertions. The ever-present, unspoken assumption of the Bardo Todol is the antinominal character of all metaphysical assertions. And also the idea of the qualitative difference of the various levels of consciousness and of the metaphysical realities conditioned by them. The ever-present unspoken assumption of the Bardo Thodol is the antinominal character of all metaphysical assertions, and also the idea of the qualitative difference of the various levels of consciousness and of the metaphysical realities conditioned by them. The background of this unusual book is not the European either-or, but a magnificently affirmative both-and. This statement may appear objectionable to the Western philosopher, for the West loves clarity and unambiguity. This statement may appear... The background of this unusual book is not the European either-or, but the affirmative both-and. This statement may appear objectionable to the Western philosopher, for the West loves clarity and unambiguity. Consequently, one philosopher clings to the position God is, while another clings equally fervently to the negation God is not. Jung clearly sees the power and breadth of the Tibetan model, but occasionally he fails to grasp its meaning and application. Jung, too, was limited, as we all are, to the social models of his tribe. He was a psychoanalyst, the father of a school. Psychotherapy and psychiatric diagnosis were the two applications which came most naturally to him. Jung misses the central concept of the Tibetan Book. This is not, as Lama Govinda reminds us, a book of the dead. It is a book of the dying, which is to say, a book of the living. It is a book of life and how to live. The concept of actual physical death was an exoteric facade adopted to fit the prejudices of the Bon tradition in Tibet. Far from being an embalmer's guide, the manual is a detailed account of how to lose the ego, how to break out of personality into new realms of consciousness, and how to avoid the involuntary, limiting processes of the ego, how to make the consciousness expansion experience endure in subsequent daily life. Jung struggles with this point. He comes close, but never quite clinches it. He had nothing in his conceptual framework which could make practical sense out of the ego loss experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo Thodol, is a book of instructions for the dead and dying. Like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it is meant to be a guide for the dead man during the period of his bardo existence. In his quote, Jung settles for the exoteric and misses the esoteric. In a later quote, he seems to come closer. The instruction given in the Bardo Thodol serves to recall to the dead man the experiences of his initiation and the teachings of his guru, for the instruction is at bottom nothing less than an initiation of the dead into the Bardo life, just as the initiation of the living was a preparation for the beyond. Such was the case, at least, with all the mystery cults in ancient civilization, from the time of the Egyptian and Eleusinian mysteries. In the initiation of the living, however, this beyond is not a world beyond death, but a reversal of the mind's intentions and outlook, a psychological beyond, or in Christian terms, a redemption from the traumas of the world and of sin. Redemption is a separation and deliverance from an earlier condition of darkness and unconsciousness and leads to a condition of illumination and releasedness, to victory and transcendence over everything given. Thus far, the Bardo turtle is, as Dr. Evans Wentz also feels, an initiation process whose purpose it is to restore to the soul the divinity it lost at birth. In still another passage, Jung continues the struggle but misses again. Nor is it the psychological use we make of it, the Tibetan Book, anything but a secondary intention, though one that is possibly sanctioned by Lamaist custom. The real purpose of this singular book is the attempt, which must seem very strange to the educated European of the 20th century, to enlighten the dead on their journey through the regions of the Bardo. The Catholic Church is the only place in the world of the white man where any provision is made for the souls of the departed. In the summary of Lama Govinda's comments which follow, we shall see that the Tibetan commentator, freed from the European concepts of Jung, moves directly to the esoteric and practical meaning of the Tibetan Book. In his autobiography written in 1960, Jung commits himself wholly to the inner vision and to the wisdom and superior reality of internal perceptions. In 1938, when his Tibetan commentary was written, he was moving in this direction, but cautiously and with the ambivalent reservations of the psychiatrist cum mystic. The dead man must desperately resist the dictates of reason as we understand it, and give up the supremacy of egohood, regarded by reason as sacrosanct. What this means in practice is complete capitulation to the objective powers of the psyche, with all that this entails, a kind of symbolical death, corresponding to the judgment of the dead in the Siddha Bardo. It means the end of all conscious, rational, morally responsible conduct of life, and a voluntary surrender to what the Bardo Todo calls karmic illusion. Karmic illusion springs from belief in a visionary world of an extremely irrational nature, which neither accords with nor derives from our rational judgments, but is the exclusive product of uninhibited imagination. It is sheer dream or fantasy, and every well-meaning person will instantly caution us against it, nor indeed can one see at first sight what is the difference between fantasies of this kind and the phantasmagoria of a lunatic. Very often, only a slight abasement du niveau mental is needed to unleash this world of illusion. Very often, only a slight abaissement du niveau mental is needed to unleash this world of illusion. The terror and darkness of this moment has its equivalent in experiences described in the opening sections of the Siddha Bardo, but the contents of this Bardo also reveal the archetypes, the karmic images which appear first in their terrifying form. The Chunyid state is equivalent to a deliberately induced psychosis. The transition, then, from the Siddha state to the Chunyid state is a dangerous reversal of the aims and intentions of the conscious mind. It is a sacrifice of the ego's stability and a surrender to the extreme uncertainty of what must seem like a chaotic riot of phantasmal forms. When Freud coined the phrase that the ego was the true seat of anxiety, he was giving voice to a very true and profound intuition. Fear of self-sacrifice lurks deep in every ego, and this fear is often only the precariously controlled demand of the unconscious forces to burst out in full strength. No one who strives for selfhood, individuation, is spared this dangerous passage, for that which is feared also belongs to the wholeness of the self, the subhuman or suprahuman world of psychic dominance, from which the ego originally emancipated itself with enormous effort, and then only partially for the sake of a more or less illusory freedom. This liberation is certainly a very necessary and very heroic undertaking, but it represents nothing final. It is merely the creation of a subject who, in order to find fulfillment, has still to be confronted by an object. This, at first sight, would appear to be the world, which is swelled out with projections for that very purpose. Here we seek and find our difficulties. Here we seek and find our enemy. Here we seek and find what is dear and precious to us, and it is comforting to know that all evil and all good is to be found out there in the visible object, where it can be conquered, punished, destroyed, or enjoyed. But nature herself does not allow this paradisal state of innocence to continue forever. There are and always have been those who cannot help but see that the world and its experiences are in the nature of a symbol, and that it really reflects something that lies hidden in the subject himself. In his own transobjective reality, it is from this profound intuition, according to Lamaist doctrine, that the Chunyad state derives its true meaning, which is why the Chunyad Bardo is entitled the Bardo of the experiencing of reality. The reality experienced in the Chunyad state is, as the last section of the corresponding Bardo teaches, the reality of thought. The thought forms appear as realities. Fantasy takes on real form, and the terrifying dream evoked by karma and played out by the unconscious dominance begins. Jung would not have been surprised by professional and institutional antagonism to psychedelics. He closes his Tibetan commentary with a poignant political aside. The Bardo Todol began by being a closed book, and so it has remained, no matter what kind of commentaries may be written upon it. For it is a book that will only open itself to a spiritual understanding, and this is a capacity which no man is born with, but which they can only acquire through special training and special experience. It is good that such to all intents and purposes useless books exist. They are meant for those queer folk who no longer set much store by the uses, aims, and meaning of present-day civilization. To provide special training for the special experience provided by psychedelic materials is the purpose of this version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And now for a tribute to Lama Anagarika Govinda. Lama Anagarika Govinda. Anagarika Govinda. Lama Anagarika Govinda. In the preceding section, the point was made that Eastern philosophy and psychology, poetic, indeterministic, experiential, inward-looking, vaguely evolutionary, open-ended, is more easily adapted to the findings of modern science than the syllogistic, certain, experimental, externalizing logic of Western psychology. The latter imitates the irrelevant rituals of the energy sciences, but ignores the data of physics and genetics, the meanings and implications. Even Jung, the most penetrating of the Western psychologists, failed to understand the basic philosophy of the Bardo Todol. Quite in contrast are the comments on the Tibetan manual by Lama Anagarika Govinda. In his opening statement at first glance would cause Judeo-Christian psychologists to snort in impatience, but a close look at these phrases reveals that they are the poetic statement of the genetic situation as currently described by biochemists and DNA researchers. It may be argued that nobody can talk about death with authority who has not died, and since nobody apparently has ever returned from death, how can anybody know what death is or what happens after it? The Tibetan will answer, there is not one person, indeed, not one living being that has not returned from death. In fact, we all have died many deaths. In fact, we all have died many deaths before we came into this incarnation, and what we call birth is merely the reverse side of death, like one of the two sides of a coin, or like a door, which we call entrance from outside and exit from inside a room. The Lama then goes on to make a second poetic comment about the potentialities of the nervous system, the complexity of the human cortical computer. It is much more astonishing that not everybody remembers his or her previous death, and because of this lack of remembering, most persons do not believe that there was a previous death, but likewise, they do not remember their recent birth, and yet they do not doubt that they were recently born. They forget that active memory is only a small part of our normal consciousness, and that our subconscious memory registers and preserves every past impression and experience which our waking mind fails to recall. The Lama then proceeds to slice directly to the esoteric meaning of the Bardo Todol, that core meaning which Jung and indeed most European Orientalists have failed to grasp. For this reason, the Bardo Todol, the Tibetan book vouchsafing liberation from the intermediate state between life and rebirth, which men call death, has been couched in symbolical language. It is a book which is sealed with the 7 seals of silence, not because its knowledge should be withheld from the uninitiated, but because its knowledge would be misunderstood, and therefore would tend to mislead and harm those who are unfitted to receive it. But the time has come to break the seals of silence, for the human race has come to the juncture where it must decide whether to be content with the subjugation of the material world or to strive after the conquest of the spiritual world by subjugating selfish desires and transcending self-imposed limitations. The Lama next describes the effects of consciousness expansion techniques. He's talking here about the method he knows, the yogic, but his words are equally applicable to psychedelic experience. There are those who, in virtue of concentration and other yogic practices, are able to bring the subconscious into the realm of discriminative consciousness and thereby to draw upon the unrestricted treasury of subconscious memory, wherein are stored the records not only of our past lives, but the records of the past of our race, the past of humanity, and of all pre-human forms of life, if not of the very consciousness that makes life possible in this universe. If through some trick of nature the gates of an individual's subconscious were suddenly to spring open, the unprepared mind would be overwhelmed and crushed. Therefore, the gates of the subconscious are guarded by all initiates and hidden behind the veil of mysteries and symbols. In a later section of his foreword, the Lama presents a more detailed elaboration of the inner meaning of the Todol. If the Bardo Todol were to be regarded as being based merely upon folklore, or as consisting of religious speculation about death and a hypothetical after-death state, it would be of interest only to anthropologists and students of religion. But the Bardo Todol is far more. It is a key to the innermost recesses of the human mind, and a guide for initiates and for those who are seeking the spiritual path of liberation. Although the Bardo Todol is at present time widely used in Tibet as a breviary and read or recited on the occasion of death, for which reason it has been aptly called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one should not forget that it was originally conceived to serve as a guide not only for the dying and the dead, but for the living as well. And herein lies the justification for having made the Tibetan Book of the Dead accessible to a wider public. Notwithstanding the popular customs and beliefs which, under the influence of age-old traditions of pre-Buddhist origin, have grown around the profound revelations of the Bardo Todol, it has value only for those who practice and realize its teaching during their lifetime. There are 2 things which have caused misunderstanding. One is that the teachings seem to be addressed to the dead or the dying. The other, that the title contains the expression liberation through hearing, in Tibetan, tosgrol. As a result, there has arisen the belief that it is sufficient to read or to recite the Bardo Todol in the presence of a dying person, or even of a person who has just died, in order to effect his or her liberation. Such misunderstanding could only have arisen among those who do not know that it is one of the oldest and most universal practices for the initiate to go through the experience of death before he can be spiritually reborn. Symbolically, he must die to his past and to his old ego before he can take his place in the new spiritual life into which they have just been initiated. The dead or dying person is addressed in the Bardo Todol mainly for three reasons. The earnest practitioner of these teachings should regard every moment of their life as if it were the last. When a follower of these teachings is actually dying, they should be reminded of the experiences at the time of initiation, or of the words of mantra of the guru, especially if the dying one's mind lacks alertness during the critical moments. And one who is still incarnate should try to surround the person dying or just dead with loving and helpful thoughts during the first stages of the new or after death state of experience, without allowing emotional attachment to interfere or to give rise to a state of morbid mental depression. Accordingly, one function of the Bardo Todol appears to be more to help those who have been left behind to adopt the right attitude towards the dead and towards the fact of death than to assist the dead who, according to Buddhist belief, will not deviate from their own karmic path. This proves that we have to do here with life itself. This proves that we have to do here with life itself and not merely with a mass for the dead, to which the Bardo Todol was reduced in later times. Under the guise of a science of death, the Bardo Todol reveals the secret of life, and therein lies its spiritual value and its universal appeal. Here, then, is the key to a mystery which has been passed down for over 2,500 years, the consciousness expansion experience, the pre-mortem and rebirth rite, the pre-mortem death and rebirth rite. The Vedic sages knew the secret, the Eleusinian initiates knew it, the Tantrics knew it. In all their esoteric writings they whisper the message: it is possible to cut beyond ego consciousness, to tune in on neurological processes which flash by at the speed of light, and to become aware of the enormous treasury of ancient racial knowledge welded into the nucleus of every cell in your body. Modern psychedelic chemicals provide a key to this forgotten realm of awareness, but just as this manual, without the psychedelic awareness, is nothing but an exercise in academic Tibetology, so too the potent chemical key is of little value without the guidance and the teachings. Westerners do not accept the existence of conscious processes for which they have no operational term. The attitude which is prevalent is, if you can't label it, and if it is beyond current notions of space-time and personality, then it is not open for investigation. Thus, we see the ego loss experience confused with schizophrenia. Thus, we see present-day psychiatrists solemnly pronouncing the psychedelic keys as psychosis-producing and dangerous. The new visionary chemicals and the pre-mortem death rebirth experience may be pushed once again into the shadows of history. Looking back, we remember that every Middle Eastern and European administrator, with the exception of certain periods of Greece and Persia, has, during the last 3,000 years, rushed to pass laws against any emerging transcendental processes. The pre-mortem death rebirth session, its adepts in any new method of consciousness expansion. The present moment in human history, as Lama Govinda points out, is critical. Now, for the first time, we possess the means of providing the enlightenment to any prepared volunteer. The enlightenment always comes, we remember, in the form of a new energy process, a physical, neurological event. For these reasons, we have prepared this psychedelic version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The secret is released once again in a new dialect, and we sit back quietly to observe whether man is ready to move ahead and to make use of the new tools provided by modern science. So that's the end of part 1. Part 2, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where we go into the 3 bardos and their descriptions, will start tomorrow.